All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 230 tonight. We are joined by special guest, Randall Carlson. We're going to be discussing Atlantis, the Younger Dryas Impact, and some metaphysics towards the end. Before we get started, why don't you check out Randall's website at randallcarlson.com. I have the link down below. He will be doing a live stream, a two-part live stream. The first one is January 27th, correct? At was it 9 p.m.? All right. He's giving me the thumbs up. So January 27th, 9 p.m. on HowTube. You can find the links. I'll actually add the link down below after the video as well. You can find it on social media. I think I saw Graham Hancock post it on Facebook as well, so you can go check that out. And Randall also tweeted it. So if you are on Twitter, you can go check that out on Twitter. And he has a podcast, if you have not checked it out already, Kosmographia. It's an excellent podcast. He does it with Russ and Kyle from Brothers of Serpent, his buddy Mike, and his buddy Bradley. So if you have not checked that out, I highly recommend going to check that out after you listen to this episode or watch it. Either one. So before we get started, if you are interested, head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/mindescapepodcast for just $2 a month. You'll get exclusive guest episodes. We actually did one with Randall the first time he was on. He gave us a lesson on sacred geometry. It's almost an hour long, so go check that out if you have not already. And we're probably going to do one again tonight. So again, check that out later if you have not already. If you have not checked out our merch, head on over to our TeePublic store. New designs you can see there, the Anubis one holding our logo. I designed that Mind Escape Portal t-shirt. So we have tons of great merch. So head on over there if you have not already. I have the link down below. And Indra's Web. IndrasWeb.org is the social media platform we created to connect open minds. So you want to speculate, hypothesize, theorize. It's a perfect place to do it. Go set up a profile. We are still working on trying to get that in the web App Store. And one more thing, if you are interested, we are giving away this Mind Escape t-shirt. We only have larges and mediums left. But if you want to win one, all you have to do is go to Apple Podcast, leave us a 5-star review, take a screenshot of it, and then send it to mindescapepodcast@gmail.com. That will enter you to win. I will pick a winner at the end of February. So, but without further ado, welcome on the show, Randall. Or welcome back, I should say.
Well, thanks for having me back, Mike, after, all the trauma of my first visit. I hope you guys are fully recovered.
Yeah,
we're getting there.
I'm not quite there yet, but I'm working on it. Another couple of months of therapy, though, I should be okay.
Takes a hot minute.
And I just want to give a shout out to Randall, because listen, we were going to do this Wednesday night, and we were having some tech issues. We finally figured out what it was. We chatted for like 3 hours trying to figure out, this dude is so generous with his time. He's not just an amazing researcher, but he's also a super cool dude. So I just want to give a shout out to you and your patience and everything and trying to work it out with me. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, shucks.
Yeah.
Should have just posted that episode, the real behind the scenes glimpse of what's going on.
They would have kicked us off every platform if that was the episode.
That's the juicy tidbits, baby.
Yeah. So I thought tonight we would... Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, Mike. What were you thinking?
No, I was just saying, I guess we will start out with the old myth, Atlantis, because I know you're going to be doing a big talk on it. We talked a little bit about it last time, but
we did.
You and I were talking off air, and I was telling you how after reading the dialogues, Plato's dialogues a lot, and rereading them, I've kind of come to the conclusion it doesn't matter to me if it's real or not, because it does show what has happened in the past and what will happen in the future. So regardless if it was a real place or not, there's definitely a lesson to be learned from it. So.
Yeah, there's certainly moral lessons to be learned from it. I see parallels between the tale of what was happening, presumably, almost 12,000 years ago, and what is happening today in some respects. Although there are universal archetypes, we can see those. They certainly come through in the Bible. People of the Christian persuasion are going to see those parallels and quite frequently will be invoking them, particularly when you look at the book of Revelation. But I think there's a lot of things in that book that very much like, let's say the prognostications of Nostradamus, that, they're open to a variety of interpretations. And depending upon whatever preconceptions you come to the symbolism with, might influence the particular type of interpretation you would give to it. So, I've read the book of Revelations many times, so I have my own interpretation of it. And I've read Plato's Atlantis many times. And for quite a while, I was pretty much on the fence about, is this strictly a moral allegory or a parable of Plato's ideal socio-political state? Does it really matter if there was a physical Atlantis ever once upon a time? And my thought was, it would matter if there was a physical existence of Atlantis at one time, because basically what Plato is describing is a type of catastrophe that could be addressed in the context of geological change. And because I study catastrophism, I actually would call myself a catastrophist. A catastrophist would be somebody who studies catastrophes, the non-linear events, those nodal points in what otherwise would be a continuum of change. And so, the other subject we're going to talk about tonight a bit is the Younger Dryas. So the thing is that, Younger Dryas clearly qualifies as a catastrophe. The interesting thing about this is that the time frame in which these major events are dated to have happened fits precisely with Plato's chronology. So that to me is something that, either it's a coincidence that you have this lineup of dates, or it's not a coincidence. And I'm always the kind of person that I'm always on the lookout for coincidences as being signals that there might be patterns that one does not see too obviously, but the coincidence, the lining up of data or events or things might be a signal that there's more, because at some point you get, how many coincidences does it take before, you realize, okay, this is not a coincidence. This is actually a pattern. It's like what I've talked about, for example, with the greatest urban fire in American history. I'll ask you this a question, see if you guys know this. What is the greatest, most disastrous urban fire in American history?
The Chicago fire?
I was going to say
you
that
got
as
it.
well.
I was going to say, if Mike doesn't get it, I'm going to come and visit you and slap him upside the head. Yes, the Chicago fire, greatest urban fire in American history. What about the two greatest, most intense forest fires in terms of rapid destruction, loss of life, and so on? I bet you don't know that.
It's not the most recent thing out in California, is it?
No, not even
That's
close,
nothing?
actually. And I'm citing this as an example of something that could be coincidence, but with a huge however in there. Okay, so let me say this. Chicago fire burst out very rapidly at about 9 p.m. on a Sunday evening on October 8th, 1871. And as far as all of the eyewitnesses would go, the first outburst of the conflagration that consumed most of the city pretty much all happened right around 9 o'clock. Okay. The greatest forest fire in American history in terms of loss of life and acreage consumed in a very short period of time was the Peshtigo fire, which is in Wisconsin. It's right up along Green Bay, Wisconsin, right? And you have the Door Peninsula that goes up. You have Green Bay that comes down off of Lake Michigan. And then Peshtigo is right up almost immediately to the east, to the west of that Door Peninsula. Okay, so Peshtigo was a town that was destroyed in this forest fire. And it was a hurricane of fire that swept pretty much swept down upon this area that it started at the south end of Green Bay, and then it swept up the peninsula and up the shoreline of Lake Michigan, pretty much wiping out everything in its path. Killed somewhere between 1,600 and perhaps as many as 2,000 people. And it destroyed like something like 1.6 million acres in a matter of a few hours. It was and at some point I'm actually in the Kosmographia podcast that we're doing now. I'm getting into a discussion of this particular forest fire. Now, here's the coincidence. The coincidence is that from the eyewitness accounts of this particular fire, there had been some small smoldering fires in the woods for days, but this was very normal for the great pine forests of Minnesota. I mean, not Minnesota, but Wisconsin of the 1870s, right? Well, it turns out that there was this sudden and tremendously huge conflagration outburst that pretty much swept in within a few hours. Again, like I said, wiped out 1.5 million acres. From the eyewitness accounts, the conflagration burst out within a few minutes, one way or another, of 9 p.m. Sunday, October 8th, 1871. Now, if you go over to, so there's a coincidence, which most historical accounts that take note of this, oftentimes if you read up on the history of forest fires in North America, and then you would get to the account of Peshtigo, they'll say, well, one of the more interesting coincidences of American history is the fact that the Peshtigo forest fire burst out at the same moment that basically as the Great Chicago Fire. A coincidence. And if it's just those two events, yeah, we can leave it at that. It's just a coincidence. However, if we jump across Lake Michigan to the other side of the lake, Manistee, Michigan, at the time was a lumber camp. And there was a huge, tremendous, catastrophic forest fire there that burst out very suddenly, swept through over 1 million acres of the woods, and wiped out a couple of lumber camps. There was not nearly as many people killed there, say, for example, as Peshtigo. But there were still people killed, and similar acreage, similar intensity of fire, similar swiftness of the onset of the conflagration. According to the eyewitnesses, and attempting to pinpoint the precise timeline of events, the conflagration burst out suddenly at about 9 p.m., October 8th, 1871. So now we've got three events, three great fires, all igniting virtually simultaneously. My point is this. Now, maybe with two events, we can dismiss it as coincidence. Let's say we add three in. Now it's not so easy to dismiss as coincidence. And at this point, I think we're justified in going, okay, is there something else going on here? And the answer is very possibly there is. Now, when you look at the whole broad picture, it gets even more bizarre because as far as the historical records can confirm, that same Sunday evening, tremendous forest fires broke out in Minnesota as well. But they're not nearly as well documented because where these fires occurred was very sparsely populated. So Chicago, most famous of the fires. And of course, because it burned up a city and there were many, many survivors and many, many witnesses. Peshtigo, the problem is that many of the people that would have borne witness to this event got burned up in the fire. See? Now, across the lake at Manistee, there weren't that many witnesses. But it was still enough witnesses and enough burned over forest area that the fire could be reconstructed. And it was a tremendously apocalyptic fire, just like Peshtigo.
I mean,
So what's the explanation? So is there an explanation? Maurice, you're looking a little puzzled, and it is something worth puzzling over.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm waiting for the answers, my friend.
I was going to say we've been camping up and down the Manistee our whole lives. And there's not a lot there now, so I can't imagine there would be too many people back then.
Right. Like I said, it was lumber camps, and so there were lumbermen that survived, lumberjacks that survived, that told the story of what happened. And very much the same type of deal as what happened across the lake when Peshtigo burned up. So there may be an answer, but if you want to find out the answer to that, of course, again, it's only speculation. But so I was intrigued by that particular coincidence and sought an answer to it. Others had speculated before me, so I drew upon their speculations. I think I've refined it and maybe added some interesting and significant details to the interpretation. But what I'm doing, guys, is I'm going to do, I did the first part on my Cosmographia podcast. My last recorded podcast was my first delving in. And what I did then is I looked at the at a fire that occurred in New Brunswick in 1824, I think, 1824, that had all the earmarks of the Peshtigo fire and the Manistee fire. And the thing that I noted about that fire, which of course being that much older, still had much sparser records, but there was still enough records to show that it had all the same type of earmarks, the suddenness with which it literally exploded. The suddenness, the intensity, everything, again, very much like the Manistee and the Peshtigo fires. The interesting thing about that one was it occurred at about 9 p.m. on October 7th, 1824, whatever I think that was the year, 1824. Now, that's only one day earlier than the Peshtigo and Manistee and Chicago fires. So I definitely noted that the similar time of year. So in attempting to come to some kind of a meaningful understanding of what may or may not have happened, I began to have to think in terms of, well, that seems to be one consistent possibility, is something that happens around that time of year. So that kind of fueled my speculations. And so I began to make a bunch of discoveries. I began to look into every single great forest fire that occurred in American history as a result of that. And another one was the Great Hinckley Fire in Minnesota in 1883. And I grew up in Minnesota. And so if you look at a map, and I feel like I should pull up a map here and see if we can share the screen. I don't know if you guys, I love looking at maps when I'm talking
absolutely.
about. Well, let's see if I can do this without
crashing the system.
Without crashing the system. All right, let's take a look here. All right, so now I'm going to go back and I'm going to try sharing the screen. Window, let's see if this works. Tell me if you see a map.
I do. Do you want me to share it?
Now I'm zooming in on the map. Are you seeing me zoom in?
Yes.
Hey, this is all right.
It's working, folks. It's working.
Yeah. Okay, so we can look on the map here and you'll see Manistee right here on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. And if we come over here, here's Green Bay. There's Marinette. Let's zoom on in, and right there is Peshtigo. So you can kind of get the geographic layout of this thing. So you had Peshtigo, Manistee down here, and Chicago right down here. So you had these three fires that broke out with near simultaneity on October 8th, 1871 at 9 p.m., right? And the Hinckley fire was not on that date, but if we zoom in here, you'll see there's Hinckley right there, Hinckley, Minnesota.
Okay.
Now we used to, when I was a kid, I was going to say, whoops. One of the things we used to do was we used to go for recreation up to the north shore of Lake Superior, which is up here, which is quite fascinating geologically. And all of this terrain up here was a byproduct of the Great Ice Age and the great meltdown that occurred at the end of the Ice Age. Anyways, you'll see Hinckley there. So if you're driving Interstate 35 North, which of course, when I was a kid going up here, it was not an interstate then, but we used to drive up, and oftentimes I would go with my grandmother and grandfather. And my grandmother used to she was very much into history and liked to tell the story. And she used to tell me the story of the Great Hinckley Fire from 1883. And this is one of those fires that has the same type of ferocity as the Peshtigo fire, the Manistee fire. And so these fires, when you get into the details of them, they're quite extraordinary. And like those other fires of 1871, the Hinckley Fire of 1883 was also associated with the simultaneous ignition of a number of other very devastating fires. So that gets us back to the whole question of coincidence or not coincidence. And so, not to try to deflect here from the basic questions that were raised by this, is that I am covering the history of these fires in detail. Let me let this dog through here. I have dogs that always want to come through when I'm...
They enjoy the show too.
They do. Okay. Now this dog, of course, is going to want to come over here. Come on and say hello to everybody. What do you guys... There's about 1.5 million people listening right now.
Oh, yeah. Totally.
Yeah, and they're all dog lovers too, so we're good.
And they're all dog lovers. Okay, good. So it's like at first when I was doing podcasts, I was like, I got to keep the dogs out. But then every time they'd break in, there'd always be people that would go, hey, we like seeing the dogs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's it. All right, go away now. Stop annoying me. Okay, where was I? So yeah, I'm getting really into detail telling these stories about these fires. And at the end of it, see, I don't want to give away the punchline. You guys understand about that, right?
Right.
What I like to do, and there are some people who get mad at me for this, but what I like to do is I don't like to necessarily give away the answer. Sometimes I do, right at the front end. I'll say, okay, this is where we're going. Other times I like to go, well, I'm going to lay out this chain of evidence, and let's see where it goes. And let me see if you, the listener, or whoever, comes to the same conclusion that I do after looking at this evidence, or come to some of the same possible interpretations as I do. So it's kind of that way with the fire. Let me put it this way, I have a surprise ending. I have a few plot twists in there that I don't really want to destroy the impact of the story by giving away the plot twist. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm chomping at the bit. So.
Okay, well, it's free. All you got to do is sign in and watch it. So and I have a lot of maps and graphics, and what I did see back in 1996, I worked on a documentary that was being funded by the now defunct Turner Broadcasting Systems, TBS. Back, remember? Were you guys old enough to remember TBS?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, did they morph into somebody else, or did they just?
I think it's still
up?
TBS.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's on basic cable. I'm pretty
well,
sure.
Yeah. Okay. So, anyways, I worked on a documentary with them that was basically about impacts from things from space. This was in '96. It was when Shoemaker Levy 9 had just happened a couple of years before, and then the comet Hale-Bopp was in the sky.
Oh,
and so there was a lot of sort of fervor and interest in things like that. So I got with a local production company, and we put together a documentary that was shown on TBS, and then a follow-up was shown on CNN. And over a period of the next couple of years, I think it was shown half a dozen times, maybe. I don't remember, but quite a few times, and it showed all over Europe. And I think the last I heard was like 20 million people had seen it, something like that. So,
amazing.
So yeah, an impressive number back 90s. Well, it actually first aired in March of 97 on, I think it was March 24th, which was the day, coincidentally, that Hale-Bopp made its closest passage to Earth. So Hale-Bopp was in the night sky the closest day that it was going to come to Earth, and this documentary showed that night. So, anyways, one of the things that I got into in that particular documentary was talking about these fires, and was it a coincidence or was it not a coincidence? So I went with a film crew to Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and I went to the Peshtigo Fire Museum there, and had a long conversation, which was documented with the curator of the museum there, and he gave me access to a lot of unpublished eyewitness accounts, which I made photocopies of most of them, and some of those subsequently have found their way into print. He was, I don't know, his name was Robert somebody. I mean, this is 96 that we were there, so I've forgotten his name. I should rewatch the documentary. But anyways, he's since passed on. There's a new curator of the Peshtigo Fire Museum, and I'm guessing that some of this stuff that I accessed back then was privileged access has probably made its way, for all I know, some of it may be on the internet now, maybe online, but in 96, I mean, who was on the internet? It was
right.
just getting started, right? So as a result of that, I had a lot of this material that I've put into this presentation that I've done, maybe half a dozen times over the last 20 years. But then I've updated it with some new interesting evidence and things that have come out that may throw new light onto some of these fires, particularly since we've had some fairly catastrophic fires in recent times in the last few years. So anyways, in doing this we're up to pushing episode 80, something high 70s now, the Kosmographia podcast. And I covered pretty much in depth the evidence for great floods and deluges, and dove into some of the worldwide myths on great floods and things like that. And then got into the geological evidence for gigantic floods. And what's interesting there is, there have been floods that have been, that I would have to call biblical in scale. Floods that wipe out huge, vast areas of land, such that any survivors could easily think that essentially the world had been destroyed. And when we segue over into talking about the Younger Dryas, we'll get into some of that. We'll get into some of those specifics of that, what I think of as this great transitionary phase between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, which would say the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic, the period called the transition from the Balling Alarod to the Younger Dryas climate. It's called, the term is chronozone. Like, chronozone is basically that, during this transition from glacial to interglacial age, there was a whole sequence of these climate changes. So in order to talk effectively about them, the climatologists, the glaciologists, and scientists of that ilk have given names to these different episodes. So when you hear the term Younger Dryas, that implies that there was an older Dryas. And there was, in fact, an older Dryas.
And his name's Maurice.
So,
and I'm dry.
So the younger, like I say, it's Younger Dryas, not Younger Dry Ass.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm sorry. I apologize for that, but I hear people pronouncing
it
that way sometimes. Okay. So Maurice isn't triggered from that comment?
Oh, no. He's good.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good. Maurice is cool.
You can say whatever you want.
Yeah, I take a beating from everybody, especially my family. So,
okay, so
what
I was getting at here was that I've really dove deep into the flood myths and then the geological evidence for these gigantic floods, and we can take a peek at that, in our conversation tonight if you'd like to, because certainly they are associated with the Younger Dryas. In fact, one of the episodes of catastrophic melting seems to associate directly with the onset of the Younger Dryas, that is now dated to 12,850 years ago. Interestingly, get this, guys. This is a segue. Before I make that segue, I'll just jump in and back a little bit, and I'll say, so I've looked extensively at the evidence for these great floods, world-destroying floods. What the ancient Greeks referred to as cataclysm, where we get the word cataclysm from, originally meant a watery destruction, right? Destruction by water, cataclysmic, right? Specifically meant destruction by water. And the Greek term was cataclysmos, right? They had a counterpart, which was destruction of the world by fire. And you've heard, the idea that the world has been alternately destroyed by fire and by water. If you look at the Bible, right? Book of Genesis recounts the destruction of the world by water, the great flood of Noah, etc. The book of Revelations at the end, basically, if you read that, it's destruction of the world by fire. So you've got the whole biblical narrative is bookended by this bimodal world destruction process, right? The Greek term for fire for destruction of the world by fire was ekparousis. The root of that word being pyro, meaning fire. A pyromaniac is somebody that obsessively lights fires, right? So cataclysmos, destruction of the world by water. Ekparousis, destruction of the world by fire. So back to the podcast, I've been really going in and exploring in depth the whole phenomena of world-destroying floods and deluge, mega floods, right? Now I'm shifting over and I'm going to explore, and have just started. I've got one full podcast now where I'm diving into some of the really unbelievable specifics of what happened during these literal firestorms. They could only be described in a sense as like gigantic tornadoes of fire. In fact, the fire that burned up Hinckley in a matter of minutes back in 1883, the fire column was seen from Duluth. Now, some of the investigators have looked at it and said, well, how is that possible? Because if you're looking at south from Duluth in the direction of Hinckley, if they are seeing the fire column has to be at least 5 miles high. How could that even be? But there were multiple witnesses up in Duluth that said they could see the fire column as it's destroying Hinckley. So that's what I'm getting into now in the Kosmographia podcast. I'm laying out the stories. I'm pulling up the eyewitness accounts. I've got the maps, the graphics, photographs. There were no photographs available taken during the fire, but there are photographs taken in the aftermath, particularly the Hinckley fire. And the devastation is about as complete as you possibly could get. Where you had thick forests with 200-foot pine trees, right? 2 and 3 foot thick at the diameter at the base. And now you see these pictures of where these forests stood, and it's just barren nothing. Literally, in fact, the fires were so hot in some cases that the thick roots of these trees that extended into the ground 8 and 10 and 12 feet were literally consumed. And it just left the hollows where the roots had been were just ash. So it's pretty amazing stuff. So that's what I'm getting into in the Kosmographia right now is addressing those fires and getting into, is there an explanation for the coincidental timing of these events? Or is it just a coincidence with no further meaning or significance? And I leave it up to the listener to make that decision. However, the evidence that I'm going to lay out, I think, strongly suggests it's something far more than mere coincidence.
Okay.
So,
well, looking forward to that.
Oh, yeah, it's a little tickle with a feather,
Especially since it's near our territory up in northern Michigan.
Yeah, exactly.
Which we did.
So,
I think we did talk about some of that stuff last time you were on, the mastodon glyph at the bottom of the stone circles near the Huron Straits, and the stone circles in Travers Bay with the mastodon carved into it. And I think we did discuss some of that stuff last time. So I love talking about there's a lot of cool stuff in Michigan. Obviously, you have Detroit, and then you have the rest of the state, which is just beautiful wilderness for the most part.
Yeah,
So.
I have been across Michigan, but I haven't really dallied. I haven't really explored Michigan. However, I want to, because what went on there at the end of the Ice Age and during the Younger Dryas and things is pretty significant. You know where Grand Rapids is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Grand Rapids is in Grand Valley. And Grand Valley is a gigantic meltwater produced sluiceway. In other words, the whole valley was filled to brim, was carved, was excavated by these giant meltwater discharges coming off the catastrophically melting ice sheets. And that's ultimately, when we talk about these biblical scale floods, we're talking about catastrophically rapid ice sheet melting, at least in one case. The other case that we find now that nature can produce biblical scale mega floods is through impacts, hypervelocity impacts of asteroids and or comets into the ocean, which produces tsunamis. One of the recent papers that I've been reading has been about evidence. I lived in Louisiana, central Louisiana, for about 4 years of my growing up years. And I didn't know this, of course, back then, but there's a limestone layer it's like under half a mile of sediment goes all the way up to northern Louisiana. And there are giant ripples that are imprinted onto this. And they're probably some of the largest current type ripples that have ever been documented. And that is a legacy of the tsunami that washed over the southern United States area as a result of the Great Cretaceous Tertiary impact. And are you guys familiar with that? The dinosaur impact, the one that wiped out the dinosaurs, right?
Chicxulub or Chicxulub?
Chicxulub, yes.
Chicxulub.
It's centered Chicxulub. And in fact, I bet
that documentary, I don't know if you've seen it, it's called what is it called? Visitors from Darker Worlds? Is that what it's called, Maurice?
Yeah, I think, I don't know. That was been a while since we watched that bad boy.
Yeah, who's the director? The guy, Grizzly Man?
Oh, Warren, or what's his name?
I think it's called, it's Fireball. Visitors from Darker Worlds.
Here we go. Okay, are you guys seeing this map?
Yes. Here, I'll pull it
Good.
up.
Right here. Chicxulub, right here. You see it? And I'm gonna zoom out so you can kind of get the perspective.
Werner Herzog.
Werner Herzog. There you go.
Okay, yeah.
If you haven't seen that documentary, Randall, I recommend it. It's called Fireball: Visitors from Darker Worlds.
Fireball. I'll check that out.
It's on,
really well done.
Yeah, it's on Apple TV. But they go through. They go to the Australia, and some of the Aborigines have these oral traditions that talk about the rainbow serpent, which is obviously referring to asteroids and meteorites and stuff like that.
Yeah. So that impact, well, at least one of the impacts, there may have been multiple impacts. I think that there was a cluster of impacts around the KT boundary, but we won't get into that discussion necessarily. But it's centered right here just north of Merida is the main town, but you have to zoom in to see Chicxulub. I had it, now I lost it, but it's right in here. It's a very little town.
Yeah.
But this gives you the overall perspective on where it was. So there was a huge tsunami that went to the north and washed up, like the evidence for these current ripples is in the limestone, in the bedrock, all the way as far as northern Louisiana, Monroe and Shreveport. And so that was tsunami. I grew up, my 4 years of living there was in Pineville right here, which is along the Red River. Now, the interesting thing along the Red River is, let me go here to go to terrain view and see if it shows up. Well, it'll show up in satellite view. Okay, if we zoom in, you can see the modern Red River. But when I zoom out, I want you to look at this lighter area, because this lighter area is where the darker area is all forested, and the lighter area, there's a lot of agriculture. But that lighter area defines the meltwater sluiceway, the conduit of huge meltwater flows during the deglaciation period. So you had this tremendous flow that came down this way, and it met a tremendous flow that was coming down what is now the Mississippi River Valley. I'll zoom out here, and you can actually see how wide this trough is.
Oh wow!
This is literally was a gigantic meltwater river, a very temporary affair, but it is the water that you can go back up to here, and there was a major. See, Lake Michigan here is a trough, so the basin of Lake Michigan is basically carved first by glaciers and then deepened by meltwater that came down through here. And if we go up here to Lake Superior.
So what was the latest that Michigan was covered in ice? Because as I mentioned to you the other day off air, they just found that 13,000-year-old Clovis campsite where they found bones, and that was in St. Joseph's County, Michigan, which is the southwestern part of Michigan.
Down here. Okay.
So what?
Well, so yeah, but by Younger Dryas times, the full extent of the glaciers had receded back. The climate actually began warming between 14 and 15,000 years ago. So as a result of that, the glaciers began to recede. They began to shrink from their maximum extent, because at their maximum extent, the glaciers came all the way down here almost to the border of Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois, and that border is now formed by the Ohio River. Let me ask you this: when I toggle between satellite view and map view, are you guys seeing that shift?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, good, great. Okay, that's good. Okay, so that was almost the southernmost extent of the ice was really almost down here. By the onset of the Younger Dryas, it had receded back up into the area of the Great Lakes. Now, the thing about with the onset of the Younger Dryas is that the Younger Dryas was this sudden, very sudden, rapid, extreme return to full glacial cold. So, in other words, if you go back to between 14 and 15,000 years ago, we're right getting at the end of what is referred to as the late glacial maximum. Meaning that was the coldest that it was and the largest that the ice sheets were. That began to shrink back. And as it began to shrink back, the climate was warming. And then the thing that was significant about the Younger Dryas was you had this sudden reversal in this sort of gentle warming trend that had been underway for a millennia and a half anyway, into full glacial cold. Now, the terms that we use, Younger Dryas, and then, like I said before, Older Dryas, refers to a wildflower called Dryas octopetala. Now, Dryas octopetala is a polar flower, and it really likes the cold weather. So it was very prolific in northwestern Europe during the depths of the Ice Age, and then it disappeared. So what happened was it disappeared during this time interval that's referred to as the Balling Alarad, during which the climate was warming. So the Older Dryas was when those polar wildflowers were present in northern Europe, unglaciated northern Europe. Then what happened is the ice began to recede back and the polar wildflowers disappeared. So the Younger Dryas is when they suddenly returned again, you see, which marked the transition from this warming period back into full glacial cold. And now here's where it's going to get interesting. And not that it's interesting already, but when we talk about the Younger Dryas was about 1,300 years in length. So it lasted from, in round numbers, say 12,900 to about 11,600 years ago. Now, at 14,600, it's now been documented there was a gigantic meltwater pulse and warming spike that occurred right around 14,600. That was followed then by this gradualistic warming. That was punctuated by the onset of the Younger Dryas, but that cold was also accompanied by a very short-lived period of intense melting. Then it went back into full glacial cold, and the ice began to expand again until the date of 11,600. At 11,600, there was a major shift again, and it was accompanied by a huge warming spike, like literally 8 or 10 degrees centigrade in a few years, right? And in a minute, I can actually pull up some graphs and show you how dramatic these warming and cooling spikes were. But this event is associated now with a sudden rise in sea level, which a number of geologists who were studying, the rise in sea level during the deglaciation phase had a term. They called it catastrophic rise events, or CREs, catastrophic rise events. There was a catastrophic rise event at 14,600. There was apparently another one at the Younger Dryas, and then at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and another one at the end of the Younger Dryas. The oldest one, 14.6, has been referred to as Meltwater Pulse 1A. The one at the end of the Younger Dryas has been referred to as Meltwater Pulse 1B. The one at the beginning of the Younger Dryas has not been given a name because it's only more recently documented. But here's where we get into another interesting coincidence. And people who do the kind of research that we do, we should always be on the lookout for coincidences, because coincidences are sometimes the signal that there's more here than meets the eye. So in this case, here's the signal. The dating of that Meltwater Pulse 1B is now the date given for the transition from the 2.5 million year long geological epoch known as the Pleistocene into the modern geological epoch, the Holocene, which has seen the rise of civilization, right? It's seen the domestication of animals, the transition to sedentary lifestyle, agricultural based rather than
Göbekli Tepe, which is 11,600 years old.
Yes, exactly. Now, if we take that and we now look up, say, in any geological book or article talking about the beginning of the Holocene, it's now dated 11,600, right? Years ago. Now we go to Plato's account of Atlantis. We're going to shift over to Plato's account of Atlantis. And you're sitting at the Socratic Forum. You got a picture, you've got the beautiful columns and lintels there, and the probably nice Corinthian columns, and, a lot of marble, and, the gang is sitting around. You got Socrates, Plato, Timaeus, Critias, maybe one or two more. They're all sitting around hanging out. Socrates says, everybody's going to tell a story, right? Some story in which they can, they can use that as an illustration of some deeper, moral or metaphysical meaning. Plato is sitting there. He's taking all this down, right? So Critias there, he says, well, I'm going to tell an old world story that I heard from an aged man, which in fact happened to be his grandfather. Now, this is Critias the Younger, who heard the story from Critias the Elder, his grandfather, and who heard it from, was it Dropidas, who, there's a succession that goes back to Solon.
So what we figured out was 4 generations when we were talking the other day?
We did. 4 generations, right. And then Plato would have been number 5. So it goes back to Solon, the Greek statesman, poet, lawgiver, philosopher, etc., who who sojourned in Egypt for 10 years. And while in Egypt, he was told the story of Atlantis by an aged Egyptian priest who said, Solon, you Greeks are like children, because you don't really remember the deep past like we do. You only remember one flood. We remember multiple floods. And he says, we remember the greatest action that your predecessors ever were engaged in. There was a great war. And he goes on to describe the war between the Atlanteans, who came forth from an island out in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, west of the Pillars of Heracles. They invaded the Mediterranean, began to enslave and subjugate everybody, right? So now the priest tells Solon this happened 9,000 years ago. Well, Solon went to Egypt in 600 BC. So do the math.
Okay, so let me stop you right there real quick. So why, when we're looking at this, we all want to talk about, the Critias and the Timaeus and all of the, the parts that reference Atlantis, and that's where we get a lot of our information. But how come people aren't really looking into more of, I guess we'd have to find something in ancient Egypt, like a papyrus or some sort of hieroglyph, but why aren't we looking there, since that's where it comes from? It doesn't actually come from Greece. So why are we so obsessed with it being a Greek thing when actually it was more of an Egyptian thing?
Well, I would say that when the Egyptian priest, who according, I think it was Plutarch, gave a name to the Egyptian priest. I think it was Sauntius.
Yeah, Sauntius of Sais.
Yeah, so Sauntius told the story, but he said, he referred to the ancient registers of 9,000 years ago. Now, let's consider. Plato gave us two accounts, in his two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. So we've got that. I mean, because we have access to what happened in Greece at the time of Plato, 23 to 2,400 years ago, right? Now you consider that in the centuries post-Plato, you had, for example, the destruction of the Alexandrian library. It's estimated that there were 500,000, 500,000 volumes of ancient lore in the library that got destroyed.
It was destroyed twice or a few times, right?
Yeah.
Like the first time was Caesar, they think, or Caesar's burning of boats and the shipyard or something along those lines. And then I was watching some movie called Agora about I forget her name, the first Greek
Hypatia.
Hypatia, the first Greek woman philosopher. And in that movie they show how the Library of Alexandria there was also burned, or they burned all of the papyruses there, the Christians and the people that were against all of the old ways and stuff like that. So
yeah, the religious fanatics. And then you had a similar sized library at Carthage that was also burned and destroyed. So between the two, you're looking at what, almost 1 million volumes. Who knows what was in there?
Yeah,
I don't. See, right. Now, this is not to say, Mike, that there isn't stuff out there waiting to be discovered, and I hope like hell there is.
Right.
Because there's a few tantalizing clues to suggest that Plato was not the sole source of the story of Atlantis. Okay? But the references are very obscure, but to me, they do suggest that there were independent accounts of Atlantis. I mean, it was Plutarch, like I said, who mentioned that Plato does not give the name of the priest who relayed the story. So if Plato had access to that information, would he not have disclosed it? Why would it have had to have been somebody else's account that provides that detail?
Right.
Unless perhaps they had access to some traditions independent of Plato. See?
Okay.
But we don't know.
Real quick, I'm going to steelman the academic view of Atlantis being an allegory, and then you can rebut what I'm saying. So academics would point to the fact that it talks about the Atlanteans fighting the Athenians. The Athenians didn't even exist in that time frame. That would be number one. Number two, Plato wrote most of his stuff is allegories, or, even if you look at the way he writes Socrates into things, most certainly Socrates didn't meet all these people that lived in different times. It was almost a reimagining of what Socrates and his philosophies, how he would have approached having dialogues with these people, is pretty much how it usually goes down. So that would be another thing. And just the fact that nobody's ever found anything, a civilization in terms of like structures and the way it was described with the metals and all the different things based on Plato's accounts. So what would you say? Those are like the three main ones I usually see academics point to as why it's just an allegory and not really an actual real physical place, or at least was.
Okay. My response would be that I absolutely think it was an allegorical on the part of Plato. However, the question is, did Plato draw upon a completely imaginary contrivance for his allegory, or did he draw upon something that had actual, we would say, historical or historicity to it? And I don't think the one excludes the other, that he would have drawn upon a real tradition to concoct his allegory. And I think that's exactly what he did. I can't prove it, and I'm willing to change my thinking, but I think that this would be a good reason why people should actually tune in to the 6 hours of concentrated analysis.
There we go.
Looking at Plato's 2 dialogues through the lens of geology, geography, oceanography, astronomy, and mythology, to see if there is a place geographically that does more or less conform to Plato's details. And, there have been many, many locations proffered for Atlantis over
Azore Islands.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about, the convergence of those tectonic plates. I know you guys did the Cosmographia, and a few years ago when we first started diving into it, that seemed the most plausible based on the descriptions, and if it was a real place, that's maybe where it would have been, and it would have maybe been above sea level pre-Younger Dryas, so I don't know.
Yeah. Well, see, up until the 1970s, most Atlantean proponents of some kind of literal Atlantis, using Plato's accounts, were led pretty much right to the Azores, right? But then what you had in the 1970s is you had a number of geologists looking at it and basically said that this was implausible. In fact, one of the books that I'm referencing in the talk coming up was published in 1978. One of the authors and editor of the book was Dorothy B. Vitaliano, who was actually a highly respected geologist back in the 70s. The title of the book was Atlantis. The title of her contribution to the book was Atlantis from the Geological Point of View. And the book was entitled Atlantis, Fact or Fiction. And this is what she says. Inasmuch as all references to Atlantis stem from Plato and no other source, which is a comment that's mostly true but not entirely, okay?
Right.
In deciding whether it is fact or fiction, or to put it another way, whether it is legend or myth, we are faced with 3 options. We can take everything Plato says quite literally. We can take his words seriously, but not literally. Or we can take Atlantis as purely and simply his invention. And then she goes back and refers to the book published in 1882 by Ignatius Donnelly. Now, have you guys ever heard of Ignatius?
Oh, yeah.
Sure. I figured you had. He wrote a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. So Dorothy Vitaliano says that since that book is still being sold in bookstores everywhere and has provided the basis for numerous other works, it is desirable to explain why his literal interpretation of Plato's description is utterly inconsistent with modern scientific knowledge. Donnelly outlined 13 propositions in support of which he then proceeded to marshal all kinds of evidence. Yes, he did. I read the book. He did marshal all kinds of evidence. But then she goes on to say, she acknowledges that, okay? She then goes on to say, though, that only 2 of these propositions are relevant to a geologically oriented discussion. And here's proposition 1. That there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea a large island, which was the remnant of an Atlantic continent and known to the ancient world as Atlantis. Proposition 2, that Atlantis perished in a terrible convulsion of nature in which the whole island sunk into the ocean with nearly all of its inhabitants. She then goes on to say, after laying out those 2 propositions and then basically setting up the scenario that the remaining 11 propositions in which Donnelly proceeds to lay out his arguments in terms of all this other evidence that he's collected, that if the two geologically oriented propositions are invalid, it invalidates everything, right? So now she goes on to say, in light of what is known today about the ocean floors, we can definitely rule out the possibility of a sunken landmass of any substantial size in the Atlantic, or for that matter, in any other ocean basins. It has now been established from the speed at which earthquake vibrations propagate through the Earth that the material of the Earth's crust underlying the continents is different from the material underlying the ocean floors, which is absolutely correct, right?
Right.
But then she says, nowhere in the ocean basins is there any sign of a large mass of continental type crust which could represent a submerged continent. Okay, so with that, she says that basically with an Atlantic site ruled out as physically impossible, all arguments based on racial, linguistic, or other cultural similarities on both sides of the ocean, which would include the rest of Donnelly's 13 propositions, must collapse. Either they are not real similarities at all, or they must be explained in other ways, including mere coincidence. So, having considered the various possibilities, let us return to the original question. Is Atlantis myth or legend? I've tried to show that an Atlantic site, and with it a literal interpretation of Plato's description, is ruled out by our present knowledge of the sea floors. The very best we can do is to grant that Plato might have derived some of his ideas from Minoan Crete in one way or another. But such a derivation is far too roundabout for Atlantis to qualify as a legend which presents a distorted view of an actual event. From the geological point of view, I fear that Atlantis must be considered just another of the myths of Plato. Now, this was written in 1978, okay? And so she says that what we now know about the ocean floor, we can definitely rule out. Now, she uses the word continent, which is misleading, because Plato uses the Greek term nesos, which unambiguously means island, right? Now, so I think using the term continent is misleading. But anyways, I'm going to jump ahead, like, to the 2000s. Here's from 2010. This is from the site of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And I think it kind of throws this whole question into a different light. And I think it pretty much negates everything that Dorothy Vitaliano was claiming about that we've got this exhaustive knowledge of the seafloor that would allow us to categorically rule out anything like a sunken island. Here's what it says. This is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration website. Like the rest of the deep ocean floor, we have explored less of the mountains of the mid-ocean ridge system than the surface of Venus or Mars or the dark side of the moon. Use of submersible or remotely operated vehicles to explore the mid-ocean ridge has provided information on less than 0.1% of the mid-ocean ridge. Much of the mid-ocean ridge still remains a mystery, and we will continue to explore it. And then jumping ahead to November of 2019, an article that appeared in The Economist, right? Under the heading of their subsection called Journeys, the Last of the Great Explorers. The ocean floor is the Earth's last great uncharted region. Oliver Franklin Wallace joins the man descending to the bottom of the deepest trenches on the planet. So my point here is that we didn't know enough in 1978 for Dorothy Vitaliano to categorically declare that we knew enough to say that there couldn't be a sunken landmass.
Right. What about like what's going on at like Tonga, that eruption that just happened? Something even larger than that. Is that a possibility at some point? I think somebody was mentioning in the comments.
My answer to that would be hell yes.
And then like even I saw a National Geographic documentary, I don't know how many years ago, but they were speculating the timelines were off, and maybe Santorini and Thera would have been Atlantis, but obviously I don't think.
Well, you heard in the thing that I read, she was mentioning Minoan Crete, and that is the most.
Right.
And if we go back to her her comment about the three possibilities, where she says we can take everything Plato says quite literally. That's one possibility. We can take his words seriously, but not literally. And so in that category, we would have places like Minoan Crete or Terra, where Santorini and that eruption, or, as has been proposed recently by Jimmy over at Bright Insight, the Recat structure in Mauritania.
That
we
one
looked
is,
into that one.
I think that's a collapsed volcanic dome, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, if anybody's interested in the geology, it's a very interesting place. I think it could be connected with the Atlantean story, and I'm going to get into that a little bit in the live stream that I do. But I think it was episode 9 of the Cosmographia podcast is devoted pretty much to a geological consideration of the Recat structure in Mauritania.
And I remember, I think History Shift, when he made that video, went through, I think the stadia is off, though, and all the measurements and the descriptions don't align with that specific site for what Atlantis was. And obviously it's in the middle of the Sahara, which, I mean, yeah, you could say maybe it was underwater, but I don't think it was underwater, at least for millions of years.
There are limestones exposed in it that are Cretaceous limestones that are 90 million years old. So 90 million years ago was underwater for sure.
Right.
Okay.
That's one thing we do know.
Yeah. So let's
There's
see
a bright
here.
insight for you.
It's my middle name, baby.
Overall, I like what Jimmy's doing. He's bringing this kind of information to a lot of people who would probably, younger people especially, that are hearing some of this for the first time.
Yeah.
I
told you my only criticism was he just released a video on like ancient Egyptians using psychedelics and entheogens, and just some of the stuff he was talking about was misleading, like as far as Blue Lotus and the effects of it. DMT, the acacia in Egypt doesn't really contain DMT. That's usually more in Australia and South America, those strains. And there's just certain things where if you actually do research on entheogens and psychedelics, you can easily arrive at the conclusion that maybe there's some liberties taken there. But
are you seeing this? I'm pulled up the Recat structure.
Yes, I will pull it up. Here we go.
All right. So if you look
Should I make
at
this full screen? Should I make
Sure, might as well. What the hell?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I'm showing here.
Get
let's
Maurice
see.
out of there.
Bye-bye.
Okay. So I'm showing here that the Recat structure is, like you said, it's a dome, a volcanic dome. And so I got into this. I really analyzed this. I'm not going to do that now. But yeah, there's a whole magma reservoir below that would have extruded its way to the surface. And what I'm going to do is this part of it, I don't know how much of this I'm going to cover in the live stream because I've already covered it in the Cosmographia, but
Sure.
I use Plato's dimensions for the ringed city and to scale, which is the stade, which is 608 feet in ancient Greece. And here to the same scale is Plato's ringed city juxtaposed upon the Recat structure. So you can see the size is way off. It's very different.
Oh, I mean, look, visually, it looks based on the physical description, yes, it looks like what you would imagine, or you've seen recreations or digital art of it and things like that. I definitely, but when it comes down to like actually doing the research and lining things up and everything, I mean, it just, I don't know.
I think it's been...
Yeah. Now, I'm going to, I will definitely, and I have no doubt that somebody, when I do the live stream, there will be a chat and people will be asking about it. So I'm going to be prepared to get into it somewhat, but I'm mostly going to be referring people to episode 9 of Cosmographia, where I spend 2 hours getting into it. And I don't want to spend 2 hours, out of the 3 hours I'm going to be doing for part 1 on that, because I have a lot more stuff. So But my point is that, okay, so in 1978, here's what happened. The geologists such as Dorothy Vitaliano decided that, the third option was the most likely. Atlantis, fact or fiction, it was fiction. There was a possibility, though, that the second option, she concluded was that it was not literal, but still important. How did she put it again? You recall. Anyways, the first option was that you take it literally. The second option was, as she said here,
myth or legend. Is that what?
First option, we can take everything Plato says quite literally.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then the second one, we can take his words seriously, but not literally, which is basically, that's the, okay, if an Atlantic site is ruled out, but we take his account seriously, but not literally, let's look for it elsewhere. And that's exactly what happened after the 70s, is when you see this huge proliferation of all these other sites being proposed for Atlantis. And if you look before the 1970s, you find that most of the studies on Atlantis, books on Atlantis and so forth, pretty much stuck to a literal interpretation of Plato's account and ended up looking in the Atlantic Ocean for some remnant of Atlantis. Then, post-1970s, when the geologists pedantically declared categorically that they could rule out an oceanic site for Atlantis, then you had basically two things. People said, yeah, we told you so, that Atlantis was just purely and simply Plato's invention, so don't waste your time even looking for a literal Atlantis. Or you had a group of researchers that said, okay, but let's say that we take his words seriously, but not literally. Where else should we look to try to find parallels with Atlantis? And so you had Antarctica, you had the British Isles, you had the Celtic Shelf, you had Bahamas, you had Cuba, you even had southeastern United States, you had Mauritania, you had Turkey. I'm trying to think of how there was a whole bunch of areas. You had, of course, Crete. You had Terra, the island of Terra, which sank because of the great volcanic eruption. So basically, in every one of those alternate locations, one or another of Plato's details had to be changed. Okay? Like you mentioned, as far as Minoan Crete, what had to happen is that the timing was changed, right? Also, we had to conclude that Plato didn't really mean outside the Pillars of Heracles, because if you're talking about Santorini, you're inside the Mediterranean. So then the Pillars of Heracles had to become somewhere else. And and that has been brought forward by a lot of people who've said, well, it was really, making the argument that it was Santorini. But that's been pretty much debunked.
What about a mistranslation of something flawed? Like Herodotus's map of that area is not really that clean, right? It's not as accurate as what we know today. So how, what if there was an interpretation going on that was they just didn't have the kind of technology that we have now? So maybe we've been looking in the wrong place based on our interpretations of their interpretation.
Well, I mean, we have a pretty good understanding of the Greek that was being spoken and written in Plato's time.
Right.
I mean, we have exhaustive academic studies on
but I'm talking about the physical, since their actual maps are skewed. How accurate do Herodotus' map is? It's not bad, but it's not that accurate.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm not really seeing the relevance of that to this issue, because
I'm saying, because if you're saying between the Pillars of Hercules or Heracles, and you're mentioning interpretations of it, I'm just saying, in terms of maybe they had a different idea. It gets passed down telephone, right? The Egyptians tell Solon passes it down, and we're getting a game of telephone going, and by the time it gets to Plato, maybe some things have been skewed, is all I'm saying.
Yes, but in this case, there's multiple other references to the Pillars of Heracles besides Plato.
Right.
That's the thing. So yeah, and they all basically put it at the same place, which is in the area of the Straits of Gibraltar. I will just quote this right from, and I don't put all that much trust in Wikipedia, but on things like this, they're usually going to be pretty right, because I could go to Encyclopedia Britannica or any number of other sources. It'll tell me the same thing. Here's Pillars of Hercules from Wikipedia. The Pillars of Hercules was the phrase that was applied in antiquity to the promontories that flank the entrance to the Strait of Gibraltar. And that is not based upon one or two vague references. There's a whole body of evidence showing that in ancient times, that the Greeks thought of the Pillars of Heracles as what is now the Straits of Gibraltar.
Okay. What about southern Spain? I know that the Donana National Park was tossed around for a little bit. I think it was Matt from Ancient Architects that did a video on it a while back. I don't know if he's still considering that, but there was these little like circular, I don't even know if they were man-made or not, but they look pretty interesting. But just Spain's pretty close to there.
Oh yeah,
that was a cool one.
Yeah,
Spain, Portugal. Well, I tell you what, let's pull up the map again. So we'll
is the Bimini Road just thrown right out the window at this point, or
no?
Yeah, we've had Dr. Gregory Little on, who's scuba dove off the coast of there and taken pictures, and we've shown those pictures on here before. Is that do you think that's a natural formation, the Bimini Road, or do you think that that's man-made?
I don't have an opinion.
Okay.
I don't categorically reject the possibility of it being artificial, but I do know from geological studies and my own geological research is that you can have rectilinear fracturing and faulting in rock. It depends on the type of rock. I haven't looked at the bedding planes. I haven't looked at the geology of the Bimini Road to have an opinion on that. So it could be. I'm not going to say yes. I'm not going to say no.
And what about that pyramid off the coast of Cuba that they call the Cuban Pyramid? It's underwater. I think they have sonar scans of it. And his theory, Dr. Gregory's theory, was that it might be some sort of infrastructure from when they were building up all like the missile stuff on the islands around there during like the Cuban Missile Crisis and stuff like that. So I don't know. I was just curious if you knew about that area at all.
I don't. Otherwise, but I will say this: I expect that we're going to find a lot of stuff, in that zone. That was the near coastal zone during the Ice Age, because remember, you got to keep in mind, during the Ice Age, sea levels are as much as 400 feet lower. So you've got vast expanses of continental shelf that were above water that would have been really the better place to settle for communities to form during the Ice Age is next to sea, right at sea level. And so, if there were villages, communities, even urban areas, they would have been wiped out by the rapid rise of sea level at the end of the last Ice Age, for the most part. But maybe not, because, if there was a pyramid built close to sea level, say 12 or 13,000 years ago, maybe we'll still find it. The problem is, there is a lot of, for example, with the rising of the sea level, there was a lot of instability along the coastlines, and you had major mass movements of material off the continents into the oceans. And so a lot of the continental shelves that were exposed, and to use the term, the geological term, subaerial, as opposed to, as contrasted with submarine, meaning under the water. Subaerial means under the atmosphere, but exposed to the atmosphere. So what happened is, with the rapid rises of sea levels and the major meteorological and climatological changes that were associated with this transitionary phase, you had a lot of instability along the coastlines and these huge mass wasting events. So if you've got like a huge landslide down into the rising sea, if there was something there that wasn't destroyed by the pounding surf of the rising sea, it might be buried under hundreds of feet of mud and sediment.
And I wouldn't even
problem.
You don't even have to take crazy liberties and say, "Oh, there was actual pyramid there." It could maybe even be a Native American mound. Like maybe that was just a civilization, Native American civilization before the flooding or whatever.
Right. I would tend to think it would not be a mound for the simple reason that mounds are built of earth, and
Right.
a stone structure is going to be much more capable of surviving a rapidly rising sea level than an earth.
So you think
an
a
earth is,
mound would just, or earthwork would just get
yes, earthwork would get
basically.
washed away.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So, what I would recommend, Mike, is that all of the questions you've asked are really good questions. Now, I can't speak specifically about a submerged pyramid off the coast of Cuba. However, what I am going to be doing is looking in depth at the whole geological question. I'm saying and arguing that it's time to circle back and reconsider the geological analysis of the whole story, with the assumption that the geologists in the 70s were premature in their dismissal of there being a geological explanation for Atlantis. That's basically where I'm coming from.
Yeah, none of the
And
academics will take it seriously even now. I mean, there's a lot of, you see it on Twitter, they say if you even look into it, it's racist or it's pseudoscience or nonsense, or they've all got different explanations.
Yeah, and my opinion is I have nothing but contempt for that kind of academics, because first of all, if I go and I look at Plato's account, and I've basically read through 4 or 5 different translations, including the slogging my way through the original Greek, right, to try to get to what he was saying, then looking at that through the lens of geology and astronomy and sciences, empirical sciences, geography, oceanography, I can say this: a lot of those academics that are dismissive of Atlantis have never even read Plato's account and don't know a damn thing about geology.
Right. And no offense, a lot of them are just art history majors that, like you mentioned, they don't know. There are some that do know geology, but for the most part, I found that a lot of them are just art history majors that think that they're the next Indiana
There's a lot
Jones.
of stigma that surrounds Atlantis at this point.
Yeah. And listen, I love art history, but come on, that doesn't qualify
I do too.
you to...
Right. No, I know. Well, that's why it's funny when you see there's things I disagree with that Robert Schoch brings to the table, but then he's a geologist. So if he's telling you this is, water erosion and you're an art history major, what do you have to offer to that conversation? Do you know what I'm saying? So
zip.
Right.
Nothing. Really? No, nothing. So, yeah, I mean, that's my problem, is that, I say, to me, there's a lot of pseudo academics out there, that basically you have an established point of view, right? And now you have people coming up, entering into the profession, and what they want is they want the recognition of their superiors, the established people who are in that particular discipline. And so if there is an established framework, if there's a dogma, they know that their entry into the academy is through their acceptance of the dogma. And that if you challenge the dogma, well, you're also going to jeopardize your acceptance into the club, if you will. And that's what it is. It's a club. And you come in and go, oh, Atlantis, all these new age woo.
But like as I mentioned before, though, like I think it's an allegory, and I think it's a powerful story. In the sense, it's almost like the allegory of the cave to me. The allegory of the cave, and I told you this off air, and I've said this many times over episodes. People that listen to our podcast regularly might be sick of it, but I think all metaphysics come from either entheogens, psychedelic use, or altered states of consciousness. How? Because in normal state of consciousness, you don't really think that you know about metaphysical things because of ideas that have been implanted over time. But where did those come from? And I think that they came from these powerful experiences where people were shown that there's more to life. There's more than what's going on. And Plato's cave, as I mentioned, could have been him participating in the Eleusinian mysteries. And in Eleusis, there's the Plutonian cave. He could have walked over to the cave, been having a psychedelic experience, and thought, man, this is groundbreaking stuff, and then came up with the allegory of the cave. Now, this is just me reimagining history, but I see that as a possibility. Same thing with Pythagoras being able to visualize geometric shapes, Euclid being able to visualize geometric shapes, Socrates coming down from a trip, and most people that have had psychedelic experiences understand that when you come down, you start to become very introspective. You want to get, you want to get on the right track. You want to get your life together. You want to be a better person. Mm-hmm. Look at his morals and his ethics and the way he talks about these things. I can equate all those things, not necessarily just to psychedelics, but altered states of consciousness. So that's where for me, I think a lot of that stuff comes from. But again, when we're talking about Atlantis, Atlantis is a powerful story because we know cataclysms are real. I mean, there's that new movie that just came out that people are talking about, Don't Look Up, with the comet coming towards Earth, and everybody's acting like an idiot and not doing what they should do. And same thing with, if we're told, hey, this is going to happen, how many people are going to get on board? How many people are not going to believe it? How many people, so it just comes down to this powerful story that it makes sense in terms of our history and our future. And it doesn't matter to me if Atlantis was a real place. Now, if they find that physical evidence, yeah, that's interesting. I'm all on board, but I'm not, like I said, I'm not necessarily worried if it's real or not, because it has the same value to me, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. And I'm with you right up until the last part. Whereas I conclude that if it was real, then it has tremendous increase in value, because it is part of a corpus of catastrophist literature that I feel is profoundly important for us to begin to understand the authentic history of this planet. Because up until this point, for most of the 20th century, strict gradualism prevailed. All change occurred one grain of sand and one drop of water at a time. That was still the dominant paradigm when Dorothy Vitaliano wrote her essay on Atlantis. It was not until the next decade that this straitjacket of strict uniformity and gradualism began to release its stranglehold on the earth sciences. So to me, what that has done is what we now know about the catastrophic history of this planet has also opened up the doors to a new discipline that's referred to as geomythology, and the idea that the myths that have come down to us contain real geologically valuable information about events that have happened in the past. And referring earlier to the stories of the great floods, we're presented with a conundrum here when we realize that completely disparate cultures that presumably had no connection in history have very similar stories about gigantic world-destroying floods. How do you explain that?
Yeah.
There have been a number of ways to explain it, some that go down to just, psychological things that we've, there was, the typical story, and it has its parallels with some of the interpretations of Atlantis being not literal, but a serious area of inquiry. That, for example, the biblical flood is basically a memory of a great flood that occurred on the Tigris-Euphrates Valley at some point, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And in the telling and retelling, it got blown out of proportion. And then when the Jews were, exiled, they picked up the story and brought it back, and it got exaggerated in the telling, and then it was grafted in simply as a device for making moral assessments of the behavior of humanity. Because again, the biblical account, like many of the other accounts, sees the flood as a type of divine retribution for the sins of mankind, that mankind was, misbehaving and had to be wiped out. And this is similar to what you find with the story of Deucalion in the Greek myths, or the story of Utnapishtim, or the story of Xisthus. Then you come over around the other side of the world and you're in North America, and you discover that, dozens and dozens, maybe even over 100 tribes of Native American people had stories of a great world-destroying deluge. Well, then you go to, now you have two extremes of interpretation. On the one hand, Well, it was just a local or regional flood. It was bad, but it got really exaggerated in the telling and retelling. On the other end, you've got this supernatural event that completely drowns the whole world. You don't need any kind of a rational scientific explanation for it because it's just God's handiwork. He's punishing the earth. So you have this huge supernatural flood. It drowns the entire world up to the highest mountains, and then the water all mysteriously disappears somewhere. So those are the two ends. Now, halfway in between that, you have mega floods that have been measured in hundreds of millions of cubic feet per second. What does that actually mean in terms of what you might see in the real world? Well, if you were lucky enough to be in a place that was in a region of 100 to let's say 500 million, 6, 7, 800, some of the floods that we know occurred that swept over North America and even over Northern Europe at the end of the last ice age, these floods were measured in hundreds of millions of cubic feet per second. Now, if you look at, say, the Pacific Northwest, where some of the most spectacular flood-produced features and landscapes that exist in the entire planet, there were flood flows that peaked at maybe 800 million cubic feet per second. Now, what does that translate into? Well, that translates, if you look at it this way, if you think of every single river on Earth, every bit of flowing water, think about all the great rivers of North America, from the Mississippi to the Missouri to the Columbia to the Hudson to the Connecticut to the Yukon to the Mackenzie. Go to South America, the Orinoco, the Amazon. Go to Africa, the Congo, the Nile, the Yellow River, the Po River, every river on Earth flowing together, all together at one time, wouldn't even be 1/10 of some of these meltwater flows. I just showed you a graphic where you could see this, where this massive water came down from the Midwest and created what is now the Mississippi River Valley. Right. So here's the thing. If you were somehow lucky enough to survive an event like that, and somehow, by whatever means, and interestingly, the legends that come from all over the planet are very similar. There's basically three ways people survive. One, they're lucky and they manage to get to the top of the highest mountain. Two, in an ark. Now, in a lot of the Native American legends, they talk about the great canoe that people survived in. Third, they climb a great tree and they're able to ride out the waters of the flood in the branches of some extremely big, powerful tree, right? Those tend to be the three most ways that people survive. Well, there are places where I've visited. There's a place called Steptoe Butte in eastern Washington. Steptoe Butte is a volcanic cone that rises up out of the rolling Palouse about 1,100 or 1,200 feet. The entire Palouse during the Great Meltdown was submerged underwater, maybe up to a couple of 100 feet deep. If you were standing on top of Steptoe Butte during this flood, which you probably wouldn't survive, but let's say you could. If you looked out during this flood, what you would see would be raging, boiling, roiling, muddy water choked with icebergs and huge logs because entire forests were being ripped up. And you would see this in every direction as far as the eye could see. In the aftermath, when the flood was finally over and you're standing there looking out onto the landscape, the previous landscape that was there prior to the flood is completely gone. It's either completely erased or it's buried. And what you would see in the aftermath, as you would look out, as far as the eye could see, would just be rolling mounds of mud with thousands of icebergs stuck in it, probably logs that had been rolling along in the floodwaters. And as far as you could see, that's all you would see. You would see no remnant of humanity. Now, you might have other survivors 100 miles, 200 miles away, but you have absolutely no means of communication. You have no way of contacting anyone. So now you come down from your mountain peak, and what do you know? The whole planet hasn't been covered by that flood, but your whole world has been. Your whole world that was in that region before the flood is now gone. And so now, and in fact, the model that is emerging for the great disruption of the human species throughout the Younger Dryas seems to be pointing directly to an interpretation where you have pockets of survivors. And these survivors were undoubtedly isolated from each other for centuries, if not millennia. And it would have taken quite some time for these pockets of survivors to repopulate their world, their region, and eventually contact others that had survived likewise. And now
So,
this is not an implausible model.
so what was going on where Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia and Turkey? What was going on where Göbekli Tepe was at that time period at the end of the Younger Dryas, 11,600 years ago? Because a lot of researchers, especially alternative ones, will speculate that this was like a meeting place after the Younger Dryas, or maybe a place of regrouping or relearning. There's a lot of that kind of speculation, and then obviously academics would just say that they're just hunter-gatherers that eventually learned, to somehow relief carve or whatever.
Why would hunter-gatherers undertake a monumental enterprise like
Right.
that? And how would they get the resources? I mean, look, when you undertake a project on a scale like that, you've got people, like all of these enterprises, if you go to whatever it is, the building of a temple. Now, I don't know if you guys have been to Egypt and looked at some of the temples, but
yet,
you have
no.
to have, you have to have a prosperous civilization to support. See, that's a prerequisite. You have to have the population to create, to support the whole infrastructure of workers and craftspeople and skilled laborers and stuff that are carrying out this work. Because that's the point. You got hunter gatherers. All the models of prehistoric hunter gatherers are small tribes from a few dozen up to 100 people. They're migratory, so they're usually moving according to the seasons and according to the herds. If you're going to undertake monumental architecture, you have to have a settled community with enough food to support an army of craftspeople to undertake these things. I mean, to me, the disconnect there is so pronounced. I can't see how a serious academic could say they think that these ancient structures were produced by hunter-gatherers.
Right. What about do you think that that's when we domesticated ourselves? If you think we even domesticated ourselves, because do you think it was like a situation where, man, we're wiped, this flood thing, let's just set up shop in one place and try and regroup? Or do you think, what do you think was happening?
Well, yeah, I think that, if you had pockets of survivors, now I would think that, looking at, let's say a modern counterpart of a catastrophe on the scale of the Younger Dryas, our civilization is gone. It's gone. A catastrophe on the scale of the Younger Dryas event would erase our modern civilization. And it would, for the most part, put most of humanity back to a very subsistence level of survival. Okay, now, if you look at the myths, one of the recurring themes that you hear over and over and over again in the myths is this, that there were either the sole survivors or survivors that weren't the sole survivers, but did survive because they had some kind of foreknowledge. I mean, if you look at the story of Xisthus, or the story of Utnapishtim, or the story of Deucalion, or the story of Noah, all have this consistent idea that they were given forewarning by some entity that knew a whole lot more than they did and was able to tell them that there was going to be this great watery catastrophe, and you better get your shit together and build a boat because this is coming. So that's consistent. Then we go over to Native Americans, and you have, the ancestors of this or that particular Native American group were forewarned by coyote. And so they built a great canoe. How did they get that? Well, the academic answer is that, well, they must have heard that from missionaries, Christian missionaries, and grafted it onto their particular theocratic worldview, their theocracy. But the problem with that is there's overwhelming documentation from early explorers, people like George Catlin, the Indian artist, who spent time with Native Americans. He was the first white person that they ever saw. and he heard those same stories from them. So they didn't get their stories from. Now, they may have heard stories like that from missionaries and then said, oh, yeah, that's just like our stories. And that undoubtedly happened. But no, they had an independent tradition that they had been preserving and handing down for who knows how many generations before the arrival of Christian missionaries. So,
I mean, I always wondered too, though, to point that you're talking about like Noah's Ark and stuff. How do we know that that wasn't influenced by like the Epic of Gilgamesh and like the Sumerians? Because the Christians or early Christians, there's a lot of symbolism, icons, and iconography. Yeah, I couldn't say. I didn't even want to try, but there's a lot of symbolism that bleeds into Christianity, or that Christianity took from the Sumerians and took from the Egyptians. Even like the Lord's Prayer to Ptah.
Sure.
Like, there's a lot of stuff that's taken. Like, how do we know that flood myth wasn't also taken? And it's similar to like Plato. Well, it originated in Egypt, but it actually became like a Greek thing.
Well, okay, I'll address that by saying that that's essentially, again, a diffusionist idea, the idea that, yeah, it all stemmed from this over-exaggerating a local flood. That's basically what that would imply, what you just said. And what I'm going to say is, without a doubt, even the Middle East bears the imprints of gigantic floods. You don't have to go. Now, I'm not saying that the Judeo-Christian account wasn't heavily influenced by other accounts in the same way that, a Native American tribe.
So it doesn't matter. It's all the same thing, even though it might have been passed down or interpreted a different way. It's still coming from the primary source.
Right. And the primary source there may have been multiple dispersed sources for flood events. I mean, because there were, we can say without question, there were gigantic floods in North America at the end of the last ice age. People who lived here would have been dramatically affected by those floods and would have had every reason to preserve stories about those floods. I mean, let's face it. If you, Mike, were the survivor of an event that wiped out civilization and you were living with a small group of survivors from a few dozen to a few hundred, and you start trying to repopulate, and you have no way of communicating. Now, let's say we have a repeat of the Younger Dryas. Well, if you were lucky enough to survive the Younger Dryas, Mike, you might be in a group of people that you had no awareness of what's going on in the outside world. You have no awareness of what's going on in the rest of the world. You maybe are the only survivors. Maybe the whole world has been destroyed, right?
Right.
But would you not consider it of the most critical importance that this story of what happened is passed down to your children?
Oh, absolutely.
And to their children, absolutely you would. So it is not some bizarre conclusion to draw that groups of people would all essentially who experienced traumatic events on this scale, would not perpetuate stories that are now find their way into the common mythical heritage of mankind. Because we cannot explain the Native American stories of the flood by saying it was diffusionist. Really. I mean, at least not in the sense that we would say, well, the Jews got their story from the Sumerians or whatever. Maybe they did. I think they probably did to some extent, right? But you can look at the Middle East, you can look at Egypt. I mean, there's abundant evidence in Egypt of gigantic floods. I mean, there is freshwater mollusks that have been found 120 to 100 feet above the modern floodplain of the Nile. This is enough to pretty much submerge the Giza Plateau. There are also gigantic plumes of sapropylitic muds that were washed into the Eastern Mediterranean, and those muds can be dated. And the dating of these muds, the most recent deposits, show them to be right around this Younger Dryas period. And in some of the wadis that, for example, that debouche, to use the French term, that open, that their mouths are into the Nile Valley, some of those wadis have boulders in them that are 20 and 30 feet in diameter. And that's the wash that came out of this wadi. A normal water flow, such as we've experienced in modern times, is not going to transport a 20 or 30 foot diameter boulder. So what I'm getting at is the geological evidence that we're now beginning to see with better eyes because of modern technology, satellite photography, ground penetrating radar, lidar, aerial photography, all of this stuff is disclosing that all over the world, Mike, is evidence of gigantic floods.
Well, how many Mayan civilizations have they found with LiDAR in the last like 5 years? Probably. I mean, there's been like 6 sites, I think, like 6 major sites.
Yeah, that nobody even hardly knew about.
It was just in the jungle in like Guatemala and different places. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And recent studies, I reported on some of that in our Cosmographia newsletter on findings that have just been published in Central America, Mexico, southern Mexico.
Yeah. No, I mean, all this stuff's fascinating. And I mean, like, look, I think it's crazy that there's even pushback that this was even a possibility and that it was like some long drawn out slow thing and, over hunting or whatever, like all these other explanations. And it's like, even your buddy Graham Hancock stuff keeps getting older, and how long, he said Clovis first has been done, and people still talk about that as the oldest people in America. But we know that I think there's a cave in Chiquahite, Mexico, where they found 30,000-year-old stone tools. There's that site in San Diego. There's like all sorts of sites all over North and South America. We've had Gregory Little on talking about these super old Native American mounds in South America. I mean, there's just tons and tons of stuff to point to where it's like, what are we doing? And
I mean, it's only a matter of time until the evidence overweighs the skeptics, I think.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Maurice on that. And I think we're seeing that happen now. And the problem is entrenched points of view. And now, we kind of talked that we weren't going to get into politics, but there is a political dimension to all of this very, very clearly. And, I'm not afraid to get into that, but we're probably not the venue for that tonight.
You better not get into it, bro.
You tread lightly, my friend.
No, I'm just. We don't talk about politics on this, but I mean, I get what you're saying. Look, anytime there's programs at stake and money at stake and books at stake and all this stuff, like the thing that really we've talked about a lot on the show is like, Thomas Kuhn, the philosophy of science, the structure of scientific revolutions, stuff like that. And it's like, what is science doing where they pretend to be scientists, but then they think whatever they're discovering at that moment is going to hold up 100, 200, 300, 1,000 years from now? It's not. It's either going to be debunked, changed, altered, replaced, whatever, you name it. I mean, the only person I can think of that's really stood the test of time, and it hasn't even been that long, is Einstein. But I'm sure Einstein will be, at some point we're going to figure some stuff out, and it's going to be like, well, that was a good shot, but well,
it depends on what
this is what gravity is, So
well, if it's rooted heavily in math, it's hard to debunk it, when it's speculation and things like that. Then
well, that's just it. We're talking about archaeologists, and I mean, geology is obviously a hard science, but when you're talking about archaeology, I mean, that's a humanity, and you're dealing with people interpreting different things based on not exact sciences. I know you can test soil samples and date certain things, but you can't date stone, and you can't date, you can't do certain things like you can do in biology and become a little bit more empirical with the stuff. So I think like I said, I just don't understand how they don't understand that. Why do they think that they're you can't question their authority when it's really not even that empirical? So.
Well, I would answer that question, but since we don't want to talk about politics, I won't answer it. Other than to say, listen, the answer to your question gets into politics, my friend.
Sure. So no, I get what you're saying.
It really does. I mean, you were talking earlier about the mass extinction of megafauna. Though that certainly has political implications.
Yeah, we were talking about that off air the other day. I know. But yeah, I mean, like I said,
or the idea that that the climate can have catastrophic upheavals all by itself without any help from us whatsoever.
Right.
Yeah.
That we're the victims, not the perpetrators. See, that's a politically unpalatable idea right now. That we would be the victims instead of the perpetrators. So let that sink in.
Yeah, no, I absolutely.
So I just wanted to touch on a little metaphysics here at the end, and then if you have enough time, we can do like a short Patreon segment. But so in terms of, we were talking Well, actually, before we get into that, earlier we were talking about everything being destroyed by fire and water, and I don't know how you feel about this, but we were going to make a T-shirt called Xerxes, Fires, and Water, oh my. Because if you look at ancient Greece, everything was either destructed by Xerxes, fires, or like all the temples and all the, the different things. Water, fire, and Xerxes were pretty much the main destructors of ancient Greece.
Yeah, I think you should probably go ahead and make that T-shirt, Mike.
There you go.
With Xerxes, in big bold letters.
Maurice really hates Xerxes.
It's fun to say his name.
Okay.
No, well, but 480 BC is that was a bad year.
Yeah. Well, I wear a 3 extra large, so
we're gonna send one your way, no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would wear it on the Cosmographia podcast.
All right, you got one coming your way, my man.
Yeah.
You know I'm gonna be dialing that up tonight. So
Michael's a T-shirt gene guru.
I'm actually wearing this one I designed. I don't know if you can see it. The Portara.
Here. Fill that screen, baby, but don't knock over your setup there.
Ooh, look at that. What is that?
I digitally drew it, the Portara of Naxos.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah. See, you asked if we've been to ancient Egypt. We have not. I would love to go to ancient Egypt, but I actually want to go to ancient. I want to go to Greece first, then Italy, then Egypt. Those are my go-to.
I would love to go to ancient Egypt. At this point, I do not yet have access to a time machine, so I'm have to be content with modern Egypt.
Yeah. Well, we can go in our minds,
Is that where you would go?
Yeah, exactly.
Hypothetically, you did have a time machine, or Doc Brown popped out. Where would you go?
Well, I would want to, listen, I lose sleep at night trying to understand what happened during the Younger Dryas. But my fear is that if I set the time machine for 12,900 years ago, as soon as I hit 12,900 years ago, I'd be obliterated.
Yeah, you pop in and get demolished instantly.
Yeah, that would be my fear. So I don't know. I mean, I've got a lot of areas of history that I'm interested in. I might just go back to the 1950s.
Yeah, I might just go back to 1965 and see what's going down.
Oh, yeah, I could listen, I was around in 1965.
Then I'll hang out with you.
Yeah, we had you on last time. I think I don't know if you specifically mentioned the dead, but we did talk about your early psychedelic experiences and how they influenced your passion for these topics and things like that.
We talked about that?
Yeah, we did. Part 1, folks.
How did you guys get me to talk about that?
Oh, bro, we got ways.
Do?
We got ways.
Gave you some Kool-Aid.
But have you mentioned you did see the dead in the early days, like 69, 70, somewhere around there?
Oh, hell yeah. I saw them about 5 or 6 times between 68 and 73.
Right in their heyday.
When they were in their prime, yeah.
Their
heyday.
We're not old enough to have seen Jerry, but he's definitely. We have 2 guitar heroes, Jerry Garcia and Trey Anastasio from Fish. And
okay.
We got to see Trey a bunch, but we've never got to see Jerry,
So you listen to any of the old Dead albums?
Oh, dude, 72, Europe 72 is my favorite.
Okay.
I'd say 72 and then 77 are my favorite years, probably. Of course, I have a particular fondness for some of their early, like first 4 or 5 albums, which were very experimental. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And their attempts to capture in music what they were experiencing with psychedelics. And then, they kind of did this interesting flip there in 1969 when they came out with Working Man's Dead.
Oh, yeah.
Which is kind of like they pushed the bounds of music to the limit. I mean, as some critics have said, they were making, exploring areas that a lot of bands or most other bands didn't even know existed. And you can kind of, I certainly got an experience of that in some of their live shows, in the late 60s. Because everybody there is drinking the Kool-Aid and probably including the Dead, and they're just taking it as far as they can go with it, But it comes through, a lot of it comes through in their first live album, Live Dead, the double, Dark Star, Saint Stephen.
There's that stuff. There's a documentary you should check out. It's called Anthem to Beauty, and it details their making of Anthem to the Sun and American Beauty. And it shows how they go from that experimental stage where they go to the desert, record desert air, and use that as the backing track for their album. And it shows them in the the studio, and they're doing nitrous and blowing coke and taking psychedelics and doing all sorts of stuff. And then it shows them going into the making of American Beauty, and they wanted, the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young showed them how to harmonize and sing, and they kind of showed Crosby, Stills and Nash how to play their instruments a little bit better, because obviously it was vice versa. The Dead never had amazing voices. They had good voices, but they never had amazing voices. And Crosby, Stills wasn't as good of musicians. So, but yeah, there's...
That's very interesting because, you definitely see that they start really harmonize American Beauty. They're harmonizing in there.
Yeah.
You don't hear that, but I've always thought Anthem of the Sun was kind of like a quintessential psychedelic trip album.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's out there. That's for sure.
It is. I mean,
their old psychedelic stuff is right now. I think the only other thing I can think of, like different band wise, would maybe be
Pink Floyd.
Yeah, Pink Floyd Echoes, or Metal, I guess is the album that it's on. That Live at Pompeii is probably my favorite Pink Floyd.
That's amazing.
If you've never seen Live at Pompeii, they're literally playing in the amphitheater at Pompeii to nobody, and they're all tripped out and they're just wailing. It's
Are we talking Dead or Pink Floyd?
Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd.
Pink Floyd. Okay. Yeah. Do you guys remember the band Quicksilver?
Yeah.
Yeah. Messenger Service. Yeah.
Yeah. Now they did what I think of as the other quintessential psychedelic trip album, which was Happy Trails. And they do an extended version. I think it's mostly live. It was recorded at the Fillmore West, where everybody, of course, is drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
But, if you've done some tripping, trails. Remember trails?
Yeah.
Tracers.
These are the trails that are being referred to now. Happy Trails was the song, the theme song of Roy Rogers and Dale Evans.
Until we meet again, yeah.
Until we meet again, happy trails to you. Keep smiling until then. Well, okay, so this is like, if you listen to the whole album is a trip. And then at the end of it, when you're coming down from the trip back to the normal world, they conclude with happy trails to you. Until we meet again. Keep smiling until then. See, happy trails. But yeah, I mean, they go out there, and I did catch Quicksilver once in concert, and yeah, like the Dead, it was almost like there was a competition going on back then to see who could push the bounds the furthest.
Sure.
And I think that Quicksilver, the Dead, and Pink Floyd were probably the three premier bands that there were a lot of bands that really explored that whole altered state of consciousness through music. But Live Dead.
That stuff's reverberated down through American music. Absolutely.
Yes, it has. And then, of course, look, the Beatles. When you listen to the Beatles' early, almost bubblegum type music, and then you get to Sgt. Pepper's and A Day in the Life with the orchestra, or you get to which album was She's So Heavy, and you listen to that. Abbey Road, yeah. So, you listen to that compared to their early, bubblegum type stuff, and you go, oh my God. Some younger people that didn't, don't really understand experientially what the 60s were about. I say, all you got to do is listen to the Beatles music.
Yeah.
Or the Dead, because the Dead, it's almost like you look at this period, sort of, you find it, you begin to see the first stirrings of it in 65, but it's definitely by 66. You see the influence of that whole milieu of psychedelic everything, touching everything from music to art to fashion to literature, even to scientific research. 66, 67, really, 67 was the summer of Haight-Ashbury and I
don't know if you've read Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe, and it accounts the whole Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters with the Grateful Dead.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Yep.
But that's like the beginning of when everybody got together. It's like a cohesive art piece where everybody's kind of contributing, even if they're not playing the instruments. They're contributing energy, and the Dead would actually play what the people were doing, dancing or whatever.
The Dead started off they were called the Warlocks. So if you're looking for early Dead stuff, they're the Warlocks, and then I think they did actually. They smoked DMT, and then they opened up some sort of book, and then it was a picture, some image of like called the Grateful Dead, and that's where they got their name from.
Yeah.
Some like weird esoteric experience. So yeah, pretty interesting.
I think
stuff.
It was actually the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
I think you're right.
I think it was.
I think you're right.
I used to know that, but yeah, I remember seeing them, and they would consult with the I Ching before they would start their concert. I saw that several times, going there and the I Ching, and they would do an I Ching reading, and then they would launch into their music. But yeah, and then you see this thing where it was almost like we were talking about, almost like this competition to see who could push the bounds the farthest. And then I think again the Grateful Dead kind of led the way, because you look at their music, how it shifted between Live Dead, Anthem of the Sun, Aoxomoxoa, into Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, where now suddenly it's almost like they've come back to earth, and now they're, got their feet back in the ground, and they've suddenly got this almost country western flavor. But then you see this kind of whole rise of you see that in a lot of bands that in the early 70s kind of moved away from that experimental realm that they were in, and that coincided with people doing all of this tripping. And then that went on for a couple of years. It peaked between 69 and 70. I mean, between 67 and 69, you went from Haight-Ashbury to Woodstock, right? So in 67, the phenomena is still isolated in these urban pockets. By 69, it swept over the whole country. And by 70, now you've got people who've gone through this experience going, we have to come up with a counter culture, another way of living. Timothy Leary sort of expressed that whole sentiment in, turn on, tune in, and drop out of the, and a lot of people took that literally and began to do that and went back to the land and began to create communes and efforts to get out of the urban areas and away from, the old entrenched ways of society, to try to create something new. Right along with that cultural movement, you see the shift in music to, bands like Poco and the Eagles and, the various bands kind of doing this country western type sound. Right. Almost a more rural sound.
Yeah.
And then that kind of was that bridged the gap. And then, of course, disco came along and ruined everything.
So, yep. I mean, look, the other thing is the thing I really love about the Dead is they would cover a lot of songs, but a lot of ones that they would cover weren't like popular songs. They were like old traditional songs or like old country songs. And when they would do that, they would add their own little spin on it too. I mean, I Know You Rider is actually an old traditional song. I think, what's the other one I'm thinking of? River.
Big River.
Big River. I think that's a traditional song. So yeah, there's a lot of
tons of them like that.
Yeah. Bridge Ryan, who's a big Deadhead, listens to our show, said they opened up an old dictionary. That's where the name came from.
An old dictionary. What dictionary would that be? Because it was a quote.
I think it was a Funkin' Wagnalls.
Let me look this up right now.
They said it in the. Did you watch that mini series on Amazon Prime?
Yeah, that's pretty good. Is it the other one? Is that the?
No, that's.
Oh no.
Yeah, I can't remember the name. Let me see.
But anyways, yeah, I mean it's awesome that you got to see him back then and experience that. Obviously, we're unfortunate. Okay.
Oh. A Long Strange Trip is the documentary.
Okay, so it's partially, you're kind of right, and Ryan's kind of right. So it says the band's name was the Warlocks, which I mentioned, and then Garcia spotted the phrase Grateful Dead, which the band later discovered to be an Egyptian prayer in a dictionary, and it just stuck.
Oh, an Egyptian prayer in a dictionary, and it was then not the Tibetan, but the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
And actually, I don't think...
was the ultimate.
Yeah, and then I don't know if I forget what album it is, but the Grateful Dead had some sort of cryptic Egyptian message too at the top, and they changed I forget what it said, but it was this long Egyptian thing that I can't think of it right now. But there's a lot of esoteric stuff. We talk about a lot of esotericism on the show. The Grateful Dead, that's one thing I like about them too, is there's a lot of esoteric themes throughout their art of their albums and their music and things like that.
One might be the best band name ever. Put the music aside, that's a phenomenal name.
Oh, I know. It's a great name. Yeah, I can still remember I was in 10th grade. I was a sophomore in high school. It probably was spring of '67, and I saw their first album, the one that I think it was just called Grateful Dead. I don't think it had a name.
Yeah, it was. Yep.
Yeah. And of course, I bought it because to me, like, I'm looking, God, look at these guys. I knew there was something.
Oh yeah.
That period of spring and summer of '67. I'm 16 years old, and I'm like, okay, something's going on out there in the world, and it was definitely clear to me the music. Well, you remember the two big hits that summer were by the Jefferson Airplane,
right?
Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, and we all know that White Rabbit was what that was inspired by, right? That was Grace Slick, inspired by her trip, and the story by Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland.
Right.
So she interpreted the Alice in Wonderland story as a metaphor for the psychedelic experience. And then, of course, that became like a #1 song all over North America. And then you had Jimi Hendrix come out that summer with Are You Experienced? And then, of course, the Beatles came out with Sgt. Pepper's. What else? Oh, and then the Doors' first album, Break On Through to the Other Side. So, I mean, the message was getting pretty loud and clear by '67.
Yeah.
And by '69, like I said, a few million young Americans had drank the Kool-Aid and saw things that our parents and our grandparents couldn't even begin to conceive of. I made some futile efforts to talk to my dad, but it ended in complete failure.
So this was what I was talking about. The original and the Grateful Dead, their original album from 1967, at the top had a passage. It read from it was taken from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It said, "In the land of the dark, the ship of the sun is drawn by the Grateful Dead."
Oh yeah.
And then the guy that did the album work changed it, I think, so you couldn't really read it or something weird like that. I remember seeing that. I forget the exact story, but it was something along those lines.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of ringing a bell.
We're gonna have to do a whole episode on the Grateful Dead, man. This is some good stuff.
Well, I think that time period was very important, and it's important to understand that, and yeah, so I'm always willing to talk about that. Let's see.
Randall reads the dead.
Yeah.
It's a new T-shirt, folks.
But yeah, I mean, like I said, I just wanted to ask you about that because I do think, I think last time we were asking you about the gorge. I think the part 1 of this, we had you on last time, and you were telling us about the geological features and how the gorge was created because we were talking about seeing bands at the Gorge Amphitheater, which is one of the most beautiful venues you could probably see a band at. So,
yeah, I didn't see a band there. I never did see a band. I saw bands at Red Rock Amphitheater, but I never saw anything at the Gorge. But yeah. I've seen the Gorge, and yeah, it would be a hell of a awesome place to see a concert. Absolutely. I think it would be fun. Let's see if I can do this. Let's see if I can share this since we were talking about it. And this is what you're referring to right up here.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
There it is. And so yeah, I remember this with the little what?
Monster.
Monster.
Yeah, I don't know what that thing is.
It looks like what's that thing from Land of the Lost or whatever? Or, do you know what I'm talking about? Those like
the old show?
Yeah.
Or the new one?
Slee Stack or something. Is that what they're called?
And you look at this, they were all so young. Look at Bob Weir. Have you seen pictures of Bob Weir recently?
Oh, he looks like an old cat. Like there's a cat that looks exactly like him. That keeps. It's like a one of those like Persian cats with like a little beard looking thing. There's one that looks exactly like him.
Or a rat dog, if you will.
Back to back pictures. But he still looks good though for his age. He like works out every day. I see him on social media. He's always working out, staying in shape for tour. They're still touring. So it's crazy to think that a band that was playing in the mid 60s is, for the people that are still alive, still touring to this day. So
I know it. It's great. I'm all for it. As far as I'm concerned, I was really saddened when Charlie Watts died, because I was listening to the Stones from their first album, all the way up through pretty much a Stones fan through the 70s. I kind of fell away, but all of my middle school and high school years, and even the years out of high school, I was listening to the Stones just like I was listening to the Beatles and all that. So it's always a little bit sad when you see incrementally, little bit by little bit, the world that you grew up in going away. You'll experience that as you get older.
Yeah. No, I get it, man. I mean, things change, and even though we're not obviously that old yet, I do feel like we've already lost a lot of the culture of what when we grew up and how we grew up and things like that. So,
and just wait till another 10, 20 years goes by. You're going to be looking back, and for me, growing up, I was born in 51, so right in the middle of the century, pretty much. So I was coming of age just during all that stuff was going on in the late 60s and early 70s. So that was really a prime time to be as old as I was during that particular epoch of history. So I, in a way, feel kind of privileged, and, I wouldn't have traded any of those events or those times for anything, really. Even the bad stuff, But
sure.
Things have changed remarkably. We didn't have computers. I mean, it was very different from the standpoint of, I lived in rural Minnesota, except for the few years I was in Louisiana. And, summer days, it would be like, hey, me and my brothers or my buddies, we'd head off, we'd get on our bikes, be home by dark, and off we'd go for the day. Very little supervision. We were very much on our own from a very early age. Started working on farms, when we're 12 and 13, doing, hard lifting and, all the kind of farm work. And I start thinking about, to me, what I'm seeing now is that the younger generation does not, they're being deprived of certain kinds of experiences that my generation and the generations before me had, because when I grew up, I could walk out my front door at night and look up at just the brilliant array of stars, the Milky Way. That was regular part of my growing up life, living on lakeshore, could go swimming, go canoeing, go fishing all the time, go camping, hiking, horseback riding. All of these kinds of things were the normal things to me that I, thought this was the way normal people grew up.
Sure.
And some, of course, still do. But, what we did was we transitioned from a society at the early 20th century that was 80% agrarian and 20% urban. And we've completely flipped. Now it's 20% rural and 80% urban. So what has happened, and so like I came into the world kind of right in the middle of that, right? But what I've seen as I've, gone through the decades of my life is, we become more and more urban. And I think that this is playing a very critical role in segregating people from a substratum of reality that was very much a part of the existence of our ancestors, and even myself when I was growing up. Because I know kids that are of college age that have never seen the Milky Way.
Yeah. No,
and
there's no connection.
Proven.
Yeah.
Right.
There's no connection to the earth anymore.
Now that's exactly right, Mike. That's exactly right. So a big part of what I'm trying to do with the next 10 years is to establish, I've been involved in education in many ways. I've I've done lectures and classes for adults, but also for children and young people. I organized classes for 15 years for kids that were being homeschooled to teach them math and science and geology and ancient history and things like that. So I had 15 years of experience working directly with trying to educate kids anywhere from 9 years old up to about 17. That was the age range in which, so one of the things that I would do is parents would bring me their kids, and I would take them through the realm of mathematics, from like beginning geometry up to pre-calculus mathematics and the introductory concepts of calculus. So the idea is to prepare kids that were not going to public schools or private schools to go into to take a college level math curriculum. So this experience taught me a lot about education, and this is not the place to get into it, but I've developed some pretty evolved ideas about how you educate kids. And for one thing, you get them out of these factories, these indoctrination factories, out into the real world. That's step one, right? And the thing I noticed with working with homeschool kids is that they were very much being integrated into the adult world by the time they were adolescents. So that by the time they hit young adulthood, they knew how to act like young adults, and they weren't still, perpetual juveniles. Because now we've got a culture and an education system that almost imposes perpetual infantilism on kids, and doesn't prepare them, for the kinds of things that happen in the real world. How to grow food, how to fix a car if it breaks down, how to fix a leak in your roof, how to plant a garden, all of these kinds of things. We're getting kids who don't know any of this. So I am working right now with a growing group of people that see the same deficiency I do, and we're developing ideas to create a new type of school where children, young adults, older adults can be together learning about some of these incredible things that are available to us now, even the kind of things that we're talking about. And so one of the things that to expand this, over the last 3 years now, I've started doing tours. I've brought now maybe over 200 people on tours to take them out, and we learn about geology, we learn about geography, we learn about rivers and lakes and forests, and learn to recognize the stars, and we talk about the myths of the stars. And I've got a tour coming up in March. I've got another one coming up in June, and another one coming up in September. And the one in coming up for June sold out within 3 weeks. Within 2 weeks, it sold out. We had to schedule another one. It sold out. We had to schedule a third one. It sold out. And now we have 100 people on the waiting list. So what this has showed to me is what I knew instinctively a decade or two ago, is that people are hungry for authentic learning, and not the kind of bullshit propaganda and indoctrination that is now infecting the higher education institution.
Would you say you're going to become a modern day Pythagoras, and then we're going to see a new age of Pythagoreans, or?
Well, I guess I hadn't thought of it that way.
I'm just kidding. I'm not insinuating you're creating an acidic cult or anything like that.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna. No, that's not what I'm doing.
Everybody must become a vegetarian.
Unlike a cult, I don't claim infallibility. And
right.
What I'm trying to do is get people, especially young people, to learn how to think on their own and think critically. And I always say, hey, don't believe everything I say. Put it to the test.
Sure.
I've thought about this. I've learned about it. Chances are I'm going to probably be right about this, but I might not be. Maybe I don't know maybe I'm not right about Atlantis. Maybe there was no real existence for Atlantis. We're not going to know until we get those submersibles out. And by the way, I'm working on that.
Yeah, but you're open-minded to being wrong, and that's good. I think that anybody that has a hypothesis or theory, you should be willing to take, a huge look at what you're presenting, and the evidence says opposite of what you're saying, or something along those lines. You should be able to look at the evidence and say I'm wrong or I'm right or maybe there's something here or whatever. And I think that that's what's lacking right now is everybody the age of the internet, the modern day Akashic record. Everybody thinks that they have all the knowledge because it's all at their fingertips, and everybody wants to be that right person. And Dunning-Kruger effect has gone wild, and everybody thinks they're the best or they know the most or whatever the case may be. And I think that if you don't know something, you don't know something. It's okay to say you don't know, and I don't think there's enough of that right now. But I think that you obviously do your homework. You've got a lot of data. You've done all the research. So I think that's why people listen to you, is because it's like, wow, this guy is prepared. This guy has put a lot of time into this. He's passionate about it, and he's putting it out there. And I think that that's why, like I said, you get the response that you get, and I think it's well deserved. So. Yeah, I mean, we appreciate what you're doing, and that's why we have you on the show, and obviously keep doing what you're doing. Again, let's wrap it up here. We can do a Patreon with Randall here if anybody's interested. We do have one up with him already that we've done in the past, but Randall's going to do this Atlantis presentation January 27th, 9 p.m. on his HowTube channel. I'll put the link down below. Is it going to be on your website too?
Yeah, and it's a two-parter. So
two-parter.
You buy a ticket, you get both parts. What I'm suggesting, we're trying to keep it no more expensive than going to the movies, but it'll be 6 hours of concentrated stuff. And once you get it, you'll have it forever. You'll be able to, download it and watch it as many times as you want. What I'm suggesting, if you're a little hard up, find a few like-minded people and have an Atlantis party and watch it. And a lot of the stuff that we touched upon, I'm going to dive into. And really, it was great that you asked the questions and brought up the issues that you did, Mike, because that's a lot of what I'm going to be addressing. And at the end of the 6 hours, I will put the question out there. Okay, on the basis of what you have just heard and learned, what do you think? Do you think that it was just an allegory, or is it possible there was a real place that fits Plato's description in his details? And I'll leave it up to the person, because one thing I'm not saying is I'm not claiming. I don't want anybody to say, oh, Randall Carlson says he's discovered Atlantis and it's such and such. No, that's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, I think that when you look at all of the possibilities that have been proposed for Atlantis that are out there, there's one place that conforms much more closely to his details, his specific information than anywhere else. And this is going back to what Vitaliano was saying. First option, do we take Plato literally? And this is what I did. I thought, okay, I'm going to take this hypothetical approach. I am going to take Plato literally, detail by detail, and see where it leads me. And that is where I'm going with this presentation. I'm going to lay it out. I'm going to spell it out. When we followed Plato's very specific details, line by line through it, and then we look at that through the lens of geology, geography, oceanography, astronomy, mythology, and so on. Where does it take us? And by the end of that 6 hours, then I intend to propose the question, was it completely an artifact of his mind? Was it something to take seriously, but not literally? It was somewhere else? Or do we look at it literally? That's the question I'm going to pose at the end, and I'm going to leave everyone to make up their own mind. However, based on the evidence that I plan to spell out, I have a feeling that a lot of people are going to go, Plato might have really been onto something. But we'll see.
You mentioned a couple things off air that piqued my interest, and I've told you my position a couple times tonight. So, I mean, I'm not saying I'll change my mind one way or another, but you got me thinking a little bit more on the topic, which I appreciate. So,
well, So I hope that you get a chance to check in. If not, you can always, if you can't, get there on the 27th. The recording will be available.
Who's got my miracle?
Yeah,
it's a dead joke, and the dead lot. If you say I'm looking for a miracle, you're looking for a free ticket to the show.
Oh, well, you must have 2 or 3 friends, right?
It was a joke. It was a joke. I'm going to check it out.
And listen, I promise you that any revenue that I make from this is going to a good cause. And,
awesome.
And the cause is basically whatever we can do to get more of this research together and get it out there to a wider audience. And ultimately, like I said, I am establishing the outlines of an infrastructure for a literal physical infrastructure that would serve the purpose of these new educational ideas.
No, absolutely. And actually, you're going on Rogan too soon, right? What date is that?
February 4th.
February 4th, he's going to be on Rogan. Well, it might not be on February 4th because I don't know if he does live anymore, but it'll probably be a couple days after that, if not. So.
Right.
So that'll be interesting. You haven't been on in a while. I'm excited to see.
Yeah, it's been 3 or 4 years. The last time I was on was the big debate with Michael Shermer, and I was on there with Graham.
It was a great episode.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I felt that was
looking forward to that.
And Michael Shermer just looked terrible for being. If you think you're a skeptic, you better go in with your stuff in order.
With your ducks in a row.
Yeah, there you go. He did not have them in a row. Based on all the stuff that he was writing in that magazine about Graham and all the false statements and comments. And then they got the guy on the phone, and you were talking with the guy, and you were blowing that guy's mind on the phone, and
Well, I think he came on, I don't know, expecting to hear some New Age woo or something, and then I started throwing some serious geology at him, and I maybe caught him off guard. I don't know.
That's good. Again, you've done your homework. You've got the data. You've done the research, and that's where you got to start with it. And like I said, we appreciate you taking the time. We're gonna record a short Patreon here because I don't know how much longer he has, or how Maurice looks like he's fading away. So again, everybody go check out Randall's website. I will put the link to his Atlantis presentation down below as well. And listen, man, we really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure, guys. It's been fun.
Thank you for your time and your sharing your expertise and your opinions. And we'll get into some more stuff. And I know we didn't get to all the stuff we wanted to talk about, but we'll get to that next time. And
next time. Right.
If anybody's interested, we're going to record a Patreon. Again, we've got one up there already from last year where he gave us a sacred geometry lesson. If you're interested, go to patreon.com/MindEscape Podcast. For just $2 a month, you'll get exclusive guest episodes and segments. And we got tons of stuff on there. We are on Discord. If anybody's interested, come chat with us on Discord. Also, go check out our TeePublic merch store. I've got some designs I created there. Cool stuff. And one more time, indrasweb.org is live. This is a social media platform we created to connect open minds. So if you want to speculate, hypothesize, theorize, perfect place to do it. Set up a profile and join up. And one more thing, just to mention again, Maurice and I are in the editing phase of our first documentary. We've got a lot of big names and a lot of little names too. It's going to be a nice mix of everyday people and professional researchers. So look forward to that. We should have a trailer sometime, hopefully soon. I got to get some stuff in gear here in the next few weeks, and hopefully we'll have a trailer, and then we'll have one of the guests on to announce it. So look for that. And that's it. We love everybody. Stay safe.